The wind across the Arizona territory carries no pity. It scrapes the soul bare, just like it scours the red rock down to bone. For Abigail Thorne, a widow trapped in a cabin built with hope and now inhabited by grief, that wind was the voice of her own loneliness. One night, as a freak blizzard clawed at her door, a different sound pierced the howl, a faint, desperate scratching. When she opened it, she wasn't met by a lost traveler or a neighbor, but by a ghost, an Apache warrior, the very man her world had taught her to fear, freezing to death on her doorstep. In that moment, she held her entire future in her hands, a loaded rifle and her last wool blanket. Her choice would not just decide their fates, but would set fire to the entire valley. The silence of the Thorne homestead was a living thing. It had weight and texture, pressing in on Abigail from the rough-hewn log walls of the cabin her late husband Thomas had built with his own hands. It had been 6 months since the fever had taken him, leaving her with nothing but 40 acres of unforgiving land, a stubborn mule named Clementine, and a silence so profound it echoed with the ghost of his laughter. Tonight the silence had been swallowed by a roar. A late October blizzard, a cruel and sudden beast had descended from the Dragoon Mountains, lashing the small cabin with ice and fury. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the single glass-paned window Thomas had been so proud of. Abigail sat by the stone fireplace, the flames a flickering orange heartbeat in the encroaching dark. She clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, her knuckles white. Every gust felt like a claw trying to pry the roof from its moorings. This land was beautiful, but it was a savage beauty that demanded a blood price for survival. She had spent the day securing what she could. Clementine was safe in the small, sturdy lean-to. The last of the firewood was stacked on the porch, covered with a heavy oilcloth. But as the temperature plummeted and the snow began to drift into impassable mounds, a primal fear took root in her heart. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The nearest neighbor, the sprawling Cain ranch, was 5 miles away, an impossible distance in this white hell. If the fire died, if the roof gave way, no one would know until the spring thaw. It was close to midnight when she heard it. At first she thought it was a branch scraping against the door, a trick of the raging wind. But then it came again, a weak but deliberate scratching. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. Her blood ran cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. No one could be out in this. No one sane. Her mind flew to the stories whispered in the town of redemption, tales of desperate men, outlaws driven from their camps by the weather, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Thomas had left his rifle, a heavy 1873 Winchester, mounted over the mantelpiece. Her hands trembled as she reached up and took it down. The cold steel was a grim comfort. She moved to the door, her stockinged feet silent on the wooden floorboards. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice, a reedy tremor nearly lost in the wind's howl. There was no answer, only another faint, shuddering scrape against the wood. It sounded less like a knock and more like an animal pawing to get in. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy bar from its brackets. With the rifle clutched in one hand, she cracked the door open a few inches, peering into the swirling vortex of white. And she saw him. He was collapsed against the doorframe, his body little more than a dark shape against the snow. An Apache. His long black hair was matted with ice. His deerskin leggings and tunic, utterly inadequate for this weather, were stiff with frost. He was unconscious or close to it, his face ashen under its copper skin. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rattling breaths. There was no weapon in his hands, no sign of aggression. There was only a man dying on her doorstep, Every instinct, every warning she had ever received from the townsfolk screamed at her to slam the door bar it and ignore what she had seen. They were the enemy, the faceless threat that haunted the edges of their settlement. Jedodiah Cain, the powerful rancher who had been making unwelcome advances since Thomas's funeral, often spoke of the Apache menace, his words dripping with a venom that chilled her more than any storm. To help this man was to invite ruin. It was treason. But then her eyes fell on his face. He was young, perhaps her own age of 24. A line of dried blood traced a path from his temple into his hairline, a stark crimson against his frozen skin. His lips were blue. This wasn't a warrior. This wasn't a menace. This was a human being freezing to death. The teachings of her father, a preacher from Ohio, rose in her mind, a gentle voice of compassion warring with the harsh chorus of survival. She couldn't leave him. To do so would be a sin colder than the storm itself. It would be an execution. With a surge of desperate strength, Abigail put the rifle down, leaning it against the wall just inside the door. She grabbed the man under his arms, his body a dead weight, and pulled. He groaned a low, guttural sound of pain. It took all of her strength, her muscles screaming in protest, but she managed to drag him inside out of the wind's murderous embrace. She slammed the door shut and dropped the bar back into place, the heavy thud sealing them inside together. He lay on her floor, a melting, broken figure. His breathing was dangerously shallow. Hypothermia. She knew the signs. She had to get him warm and fast. The fire was her only chance. She dragged him closer to the hearth, the heat from the flames washing over his frozen form. His clothes were soaked and freezing. With fumbling, hesitant hands, she began the difficult work of stripping the icy layers from his body. She tried not to look at the lean, wiry muscles of his chest, at the old scars that told stories of a life she couldn't imagine. She saw a newer wound on his side, a ragged gash that looked to be from a bullet graze, inflamed and angry. He was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering in a bone-jarring rhythm. She knew it was a sign his body was still fighting, but it wouldn't be enough. She looked around her small, sparse cabin. She had one thick wool blanket, a wedding gift from her mother. It was her only real comfort on the coldest nights, her one true warmth. Without a second thought, she pulled it from her cot and wrapped it tightly around his shivering frame, tucking it under his chin. She then stoked the fire, adding precious logs until it blazed with a fierce, life-giving heat. She knelt beside him, waiting her husband's rifle always in her peripheral vision. Hours passed. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a fragile truce had been declared. She, a lone white woman, was sharing her fire and her only blanket with a freezing Apache, an act of mercy that felt like the most dangerous gamble of her life. As exhaustion finally claimed her, she slumped into her rocking chair, the Winchester, across her lap, watching the stranger breathe in the flickering firelight. The world returned to Abigail in shades of grey and the biting cold of a dead fire. A sliver of dawn light pierced the gloom through a gap in the curtains, illuminating a cabin that was deathly still and frigid. Her neck was stiff, her body aching from a night spent in the rocking chair, the heavy rifle having slipped from her lap to the floor. Her first panicked thought was of the man. The floor where he had lain was empty. The blanket, her mother's blanket, was gone. A wave of cold dread, far more chilling than the morning air, washed over her. He had taken her only blanket and left. The stories, the warnings of Jedodiah Cain and the others crashed down on her. Fool. She was a naive fool. She had harbored a wolf, and he had stolen from her before, melting back into the wilderness. She scrambled to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bar was lifted. He was gone. Peering outside, she was blinded by the pristine, sun-drenched landscape. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, draped in a thick, immaculate shroud of white. The beauty of it was a bitter mockery. She felt a tear of frustration and self-recrimination freeze on her cheek. Alone again, and now colder, more vulnerable than before, she turned back into the cabin, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and began the ritual of survival. She knelt at the hearth, her hands trembling as she gathered kindling to coax the embers back to life. It was then that she saw it. Placed neatly beside the cold stones of the fireplace was a single perfect eagle feather. It was long and powerful, its white tip marked with a band of black, a thing of stark and profound beauty. It hadn't been there last night. It was a message. But what did it mean? Just as she was puzzling over the feather, a new sound reached her, the crisp crunch of footsteps in the deep snow outside. Instantly she grabbed the Winchester, her fear replaced by a hardened resolve. She would not be made a fool of twice. She crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. It was him. The Apache. He was standing 20 yards from her cabin, his back to her, looking out at the rising sun. And he was not empty-handed. In one hand, he held her wool blanket, folded neatly. In the other, he carried a lit torch, its flames dancing bright and defiant against the snow. Slung over his shoulder was the carcass of a freshly killed jackrabbit. Abigail watched, mesmerized and confused, as he walked not towards her cabin, but towards her woodpile on the porch. He carefully placed the folded blanket on the driest spot, away from the snow. Then he knelt and used his torch to expertly light the kindling she had stored there, building a small controlled fire on a flat stone she used for splitting logs. It was a gift. He hadn't just returned with her blanket, he had returned with fire. He had brought her warmth and food. He rose and turned his dark eyes, meeting hers through the window. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the snow-covered clearing. There was no menace in his gaze, only a quiet, solemn intensity. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of gratitude. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, his powerful form disappearing into the blinding white of the woods. Abigail slowly lowered the rifle, her mind reeling. This act flew in the face of everything she had been taught. It was a gesture of profound reciprocity. He had repaid her kindness, not with theft, but with a gift of survival that was far more valuable than the blanket itself. Shaken, she went outside. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. She picked up the blanket. It was heavy and real in her hands. The small fire he had built crackled merrily, a beacon of warmth. The jackrabbit lay in the snow, a promise of a hot meal. And on top of the blanket was the eagle feather. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the silent man. As she skinned the rabbit and set it to stew over her newly rekindled hearth, she replayed the events in her mind. The vulnerability in his eyes, the trust he had placed in her by falling unconscious on her floor, the quiet dignity of his return. She had a name for him. Now, a name she had given him in the quiet hours of the night as she watched him breathe Kale. It felt strong, like the mountains that loomed over her valley. Days turned into a week. The snow began to melt under the relentless Arizona sun, turning the land into a muddy mire. Life for Abigail returned to its lonely rhythm, but something had shifted. The silence in the cabin felt different now, less like an absence, and more like a space of quiet contemplation. She kept the eagle feather on the mantelpiece, a stark contrast to the polished wood of the rifle. Then one evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and orange, she found a bundle of dried herbs tied with a strip of rawhide on her porch. She recognized some of them from a book on local flora. Thomas had owned yarrow for staunching blood willow bark for fever. It was medicine. A few days later, a brace of quail appeared, plucked and ready for the pot. He never let her see him. These were silent gifts left at the threshold between her world and his. Kyle was watching over her. The realization sent a strange shiver through her, a feeling that was equal parts fear and a startling, unfamiliar flutter of warmth. The man she had saved from the storm had become her silent, unseen guardian. And in the vast, dangerous loneliness of the territory, she found herself not fearing his presence, but drawing a strange and unsettling comfort from it. This secret connection was a fragile, dangerous thing, a flickering flame in a world determined to snuff it out. The unspoken arrangement between Abigail and Cale continued as the land thawed, and green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth. The gifts became a quiet language between them. A broken fence post would be mysteriously mended overnight, with rawhide lashings far stronger than her own clumsy repairs. A small pouch of ground corn would appear on her doorstep when her own supplies were running low. In return, Abigail would sometimes leave a small loaf of her sourdough bread or a jar of wild berry preserves on the porch stump, and by morning it would be gone. She caught glimpses of him now, and then a fleeting shadow at the tree line, the silent passage of a lone rider on the distant mesa. Each sighting sent a jolt through her, a mixture of apprehension and a deep, resonant curiosity. Who was this man? What tribe did he belong to? Why was he alone? One afternoon, while checking a line of snares she had set by the creek, her foot slipped on a mossy rock. She fell hard, her arm twisting beneath her at an unnatural angle. A blinding flash of pain shot from her wrist to her shoulder. She managed to stumble back to the cabin, cradling her arm, tears of pain and frustration streaking her dusty cheeks. The wrist was already swelling, turning a sickening shade of purple. It wasn't broken, she thought, but it was badly sprained and useless. Panic set in. How could she chop wood, carry water, or even saddle Clementine with one arm? A simple injury like this could be a death sentence for someone living alone. That night she sat in misery, her arm bound in a makeshift sling, the pain a throbbing, constant companion. She must have drifted into a fitful sleep in her chair, because she was awoken by a soft sound on the porch. Her heart leapt, but it was not with fear. Limping to the door, she opened it to find a poultice of crushed green leaves packed in a small, damp deerskin pouch. The scent was earthy and medicinal. Without hesitation, she took it. She carefully unwrapped her arm and applied the cool, soothing paste to her swollen wrist. The relief was almost immediate, a gentle coolness that seemed to draw the fire and pain out of her skin. She rebound it with fresh cloth, and for the first time that day felt a sliver of hope. The next morning she looked towards the tree line, the place she most often sensed his presence, and for the first time called out, "Thank you." Her voice felt small in the vast expanse, but she knew he would hear. A few moments later, he stepped out from behind a thicket of juniper. It was the first time she had seen him so clearly in the daylight since the blizzard. He was tall and lean, his bearing proud. The wound on his temple had healed into a thin scar. He simply stood there, watching her. Emboldened, Abigail took a tentative step off her porch. "I'm Abigail," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She pointed to herself. "Abigail Thorne." He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he touched his own chest. "Cale," he said. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble like distant thunder. The name vibrated through her. It was real. He was real. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, separated by 50 yards of muddy ground and 1,000 years of mistrust between their peoples. Slowly he began to walk towards her. Abigail's breath caught in her chest, but she held her ground. He stopped 10 feet away, his dark eyes scanning her from her worn dress to her injured arm. He glanced at the poultice, then back at her face, and gave a single curt nod. It was in that moment that Jedodiah Cain chose to ride up. The big man appeared over the rise on his powerful bay stallion, his son Caleb, trailing behind him. Cain was in his late 40s, with a thick neck, a florid face, and eyes the color of faded denim that missed nothing. He reined in his horse sharply, his gaze sweeping from Abigail to the silent Apache warrior, a look of pure venomous shock on his face. "Mrs." Thorn Cain's voice was a low growl, thick with false concern. "Is this buck bothering you?" Abigail's blood ran cold. She could feel the fragile piece of her world shattering. "Mr. Cain, no, he was just passing by." The lie was thin, and she knew it. Cain's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene, Abigail standing on her land, looking not at all distressed, and an Apache warrior, standing far too close for comfort, looking not at all subservient. Caleb, a hulking, sullen young man with his father's cruel mouth, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. Passing by as he, Cain sneered, his gaze fixed on Cale with undisguised hatred. "Looks to me like he's trespassing on my future property." Abigail stiffened. "This is still my property, Mr. Cain. For now," Cain said smoothly, his eyes sliding back to her. "But a lone woman with a sprained wrist. It's a dangerous world, Abigail. You know my offer still stands. Marry me. I can protect you. I can work this land. I can keep you safe from intruders." The threat was unmistakable. He wasn't offering protection. He was offering to be the lesser of two evils. The look he gave Cale was one of possessive, violent promise. Kyle did not move a muscle. His face remained a stoic mask, but Abigail saw the shift in his posture, the coiling of tension in his shoulders. He was like a panther, perfectly still, but ready to spring. "I am not in need of your protection, Mr. Cain." Abigail said, her voice much firmer than she felt. "And this man has done me no harm. I suggest you be on your way." Jedodiah Cain stared at her for a long, hard moment. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Have it your way, widow. But when you find your well poisoned or your mule missing, don't come crying to me. Some folks around here have long memories about who their friends are and who they ain't." With a final contemptuous glare at Kyle, Cain jerked his horse's reins and rode off, Caleb glowering over his shoulder as he followed. The air, thick with their menace, slowly began to clear. Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She turned to Kyle. The quiet space between them was now charged with a new, dangerous energy. His presence was no longer a secret. The whispers on the wind had just become a public accusation. Kyle's gaze followed the retreating riders, his eyes hard as flint. Then he looked back at Abigail, and for the first time she saw something other than stoicism in their dark depths. It was concern. He took a half step towards her, then stopped. He looked at her injured arm, then at the homestead, then back at her. Without another word, he turned and melted back into the trees, leaving Abigail to face the storm that was no longer made of wind and snow, but of the hatred of men. Jedodiah Cain was a patient man when it came to land, but his patience had its limits. His visit was not an idle threat. It was the opening salvo in a war Abigail was ill-equipped to fight. The very next Sunday, when she made her monthly trip into the town of Redemption for supplies, she felt the change immediately. It was in the way Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, suddenly became very busy, arranging sacks of flour when Abigail approached the counter. It was in the way men who used to tip their hats and offer a polite "Ma'am" now looked straight through her, their faces hard and unforgiving. The whispers followed her down the dusty main street, venomous and sharp as hornets. Indian lover. Saw it with my own eyes, bold as brass, standing with a filthy savage. Cain ought to run her off that land. It ain't right. The poison had been spread effectively by Cain and his son. In this small, isolated community, fear was a currency, and Jedodiah Cain owned the bank. To befriend an Apache was to side with the enemy who haunted their nightmares, the specter of raids and violence that justified their presence on this stolen land. Abigail held her head high, her jaw set, but inside she was crumbling. The ostracism was a heavy, suffocating cloak. She bought her flour and salt, enduring the cold silence, and guided Clementine back towards the homestead, the 5-mile journey feeling like 100. The world had shrunk to the 40 acres of her property. Beyond its borders she was an outcast. Cain's pressure grew more direct. One morning she found one of her water barrels overturned, the precious water soaked into the dry ground. A few days later, the small vegetable garden she had painstakingly tended was trampled, the tender shoots crushed into the mud by heavy boot prints. These were petty acts of cruelty, designed to wear her down, to make her life just a little bit harder, to remind her of her vulnerability. The true escalation came in the form of Caleb Cain. He began to ride the perimeter of her property, a silent, menacing presence. He'd sit on his horse on the ridge overlooking her cabin, just watching her for hours, his presence a constant, unnerving weight. He was a vulture waiting for her to weaken. One afternoon, Abigail was returning from the creek, a bucket of water in her good hand, when Caleb blocked her path. He dismounted his bulk, seeming to swallow the light on the trail. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thorne." He drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Father sent me to see if you'd come to your senses yet. It's a lonely life out here for a pretty little thing like you." "I am fine, Caleb. Please let me pass," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady, refusing to show the fear that was knotting her stomach. Caleb laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Fine? Don't look fine to me. Looks like you could use a man's help, a white man's help." He took a step closer, his smell a foul mix of sweat horses and cheap whiskey. "Or maybe you prefer the company of them redskins. Heard you got a pet savage who does chores for you." Before Abigail could respond, his eyes darted to the ground beside her. There, half hidden in the grass, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Cale had left it on her porch that morning. She'd been carrying it in her pocket, and it must have fallen out. Caleb's eyes lit up with a malicious glee. He bent down and snatched it up. "Well, what do we have here? A little gift from your buck." He examined the delicate carving, then his face twisted into a sneer. He threw the bird to the ground and crushed it under his heavy boot, grinding the splintered wood into the dirt. A choked cry of anger and loss escaped Abigail's lips. It was a senseless, cruel act. "That's what we do with Indian trash," Caleb grunted, taking another menacing step towards her. "And the whores who keep 'em." Suddenly, a sound swift and sharp as a hornet's sting cut through the air. Thwip! An arrow buried itself in the ground, a hair's breadth from Caleb's boot. It quivered, a silent, deadly warning. Caleb froze his face, draining of color. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, scanning the dense woods. There was nothing but shadows and leaves. He looked from the arrow to Abigail's cold, furious face, and for the first time he looked truly afraid. He scrambled back to his horse, clumsy in his haste, and galloped away without a backward glance. Abigail stood trembling, her knuckles white on the bucket handle. The silence that descended was absolute. After a moment, Kyle stepped from the trees. He held a simple bow, another arrow resting on the string. He looked not at her, but at the spot where Caleb had disappeared, his expression grim. He had been watching. He had protected her. But his protection had come at a cost. Caleb would go straight to his father, and now they had proof. An Apache had fired a weapon at him. The story would be twisted, magnified. An unprovoked attack. The whispers would become a roar. Sheriff Brody rode out 2 days later. He was an older man with a weary, leathery face and eyes that had seen too much. He was a fair man, but he was also a practical one, responsible for the safety of a town perpetually on edge. "Abigail," he said, dismounting and removing his hat. "I've had a complaint from Jedodiah Cain. His boy Caleb claims your Apache friend shot an arrow at him." "Caleb was threatening me." "Sheriff," Abigail stated, her voice even. "He was on my land and he was threatening me. The arrow was a warning. It harmed no one." Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe so. But you see my position. A white boy's word against an Indian who ain't even supposed to be here. The treaty says they're to stay north of the Black River." "This is his home," Abigail said more fiercely than she intended. "His people were here long before any treaty." The sheriff looked at her, his gaze penetrating. "Folks are scared, Abigail. Cain is whipping them into a frenzy. They're talking about forming a posse, about coming out here to deal with the problem. You're playing with fire. If I were you, I'd tell your friend to disappear, for his own good, and for yours." His words hung in the air, a final dire warning. The law would not protect her. The town would not support her. Jedodiah Cain's shadow now covered everything, and she and Kyle were trapped beneath it, alone and exposed. The next move would not be a trampled garden or a crushed carving. The next move would be for blood. Sheriff Brody's visit was a final severing. The lines had been drawn, and Abigail knew she stood on the wrong side of them in the eyes of everyone she knew. The isolation she had felt after Thomas's death was a pale ghost compared to this. This was an active, malevolent shunning. She was no longer just a widow. She was a pariah, a collaborator with the enemy. Yet in the heart of this desolation, something unexpected was growing. Fear was slowly being replaced by a defiant resolve. This cabin, this land was hers. It was the last piece of Thomas she had, and it was a place she had learned to survive in on her own terms. She would not be run off by the bullying of Jedodiah Cain or the ignorance of the town. Her interactions with Cale changed. The danger had stripped away their caution. He no longer remained a shadow at the edge of the woods. He would appear in the evenings, emerging from the twilight to help her stack firewood or secure the lean-to for the night. Their communication was still a patchwork of gestures and single words in English and Apache, but a deeper understanding was taking root. She learned that the gash on his side from the blizzard night was from a cavalry bullet, a skirmish that had separated him from his small clan. He was not an outcast, but a survivor, trying to find his way back to his people who were hiding in the labyrinthine canyons of the Dragoon Mountains. One evening, as they sat on the porch steps, the setting sun bleeding across the horizon, he pointed to the small spring that trickled from the rocks at the back of her property, the very reason this land was so valuable. "Lee," he said, his voice quiet. "Water." He then touched his chest and made a sweeping gesture towards the mountains. Ju. My people. The mountains." He pointed back at the spring. Nali, Ju, water of the mountains, water for the people. Abigail began to understand. The spring wasn't just a convenience, it was a sacred or vital place for his clan. Her land was not just a random plot to him. It held a significance that went far beyond its value in dollars or acres. His protection of her was intertwined with his protection of this place. His gratitude had been the seed, but this shared purpose was the root. As he spoke, she found herself not watching his hands, but his face. The firelight carved sharp angles on his high cheekbones and cast his eyes in deep shadow. She saw the weariness in him, the immense burden he carried. She saw the strength that had allowed him to survive a blizzard and a bullet wound. And for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the feeling that had been quietly growing in her heart. It wasn't just gratitude or camaraderie. It was something deeper, something terrifying and beautiful. She reached out her fingers, hesitantly touching the back of his hand where it rested on the step. His skin was warm, his hand strong and calloused. He went still and slowly turned his hand over his fingers, gently closing around hers. It was a simple touch, but it was an earthquake. In that moment, the chasm between their two worlds, the world of the white settlers and the world of the Ennord, the people, as he called them, vanished, leaving only a man and a woman finding solace in the encroaching darkness. They will not have this land. Kyle, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I won't let them. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, and he understood her meaning went far beyond the land itself. He squeezed her hand gently. Abigail. He said her name, a soft prayer on his lips. Their bond, forged in a blizzard and tempered by hatred, was sealed. They were no longer a lonely widow and a solitary warrior. They were allies, partners. They were a secret we in a world that only recognized us and them. But their private world was about to be invaded. A few days later, while Abigail was mending a shirt on the porch, Kyle appeared suddenly, his movements urgent, his face etched with grim news. He had been scouting. He'd followed Caleb Cain to a rendezvous with a group of rough-looking men, hired guns from the look of them, men who rode with a swagger that spoke of casual violence. Kyle's English was broken, but his meaning was terrifyingly clear. Cain, he said, his voice low and hard. He made the motion of many men on horseback, their hands holding rifles. Come here, fire, for you. Jedodiah was done with petty intimidation. He was done waiting her out. He was going to take what he wanted by force. Kyle had overheard their plan. They would attack the homestead at dawn in 2 days' time. They would burn the cabin, and the official story spread by Cain would be that it was a savage Apache raid. Abigail would be a tragic victim. Kyle's people would be blamed, and the U.S. Army would be called in to pacify the area. In the ensuing chaos, Jedodiah Cain would be free to quietly absorb her 40 acres with its precious spring into his ever-growing empire. The plan was brutal and sickeningly perfect. Abigail's heart seized with icy terror. Sheriff Brody's warning echoed in her ears. No one would believe her. It would be her word against a half-dozen men and a respected rancher. She looked at Kyle, at his resolute, worried face. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kyle's gaze was steady. He looked from her to the cabin, then towards the mountains. He had a choice to make. He could flee, save himself, and try to warn his people, or he could stay and fight for this woman, for this small patch of ground that held the water his people needed. He reached out and gently touched the eagle feather she had tucked into a small vase on her windowsill. Then he looked back at her, his decision made. "We fight," he said. The 2 days before the dawn attack, were a blur of frantic, silent preparation. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, every gust of wind sounding like the hoofbeats of approaching riders, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden threat. The quiet homestead, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a fortress on the brink of a siege. Kyle was a man transformed. The quiet guardian was now a focused, efficient warrior. He moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and reassuring. He showed Abigail how to reinforce the single window, not by boarding it completely, but by wedging a heavy table against it, leaving a small gap to shoot through. He barricaded the back door with the heavy iron stove, leaving the main entrance as the only deadly choke point. He took Thomas's Winchester, handling it with a familiarity that surprised her. He checked the action, the sights, his movements economical and sure. He had brought his bow and a quiver of arrows, their stone heads chipped to a lethal sharpness. Abigail watched him, a knot of fear and awe in her stomach. This was the man the town feared, the warrior of their nightmares. But his every action was dedicated to her protection. He taught her in swift, urgent gestures where to position herself, how to reload the spare pistol Thomas had kept in a drawer, how to use the cabin's angles for cover. He was preparing her for a fight to the death. As dusk fell on the final day, an oppressive silence settled over the valley. Kyle stood on the porch, his silhouette dark against the bruised, purple sky, scanning the darkening ridges. Abigail came to stand beside him. "Will it just be us?" she asked softly. Kyle did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the mountains, a deep internal struggle playing out across his stoic features. To fight here meant staying away from his people, leaving them vulnerable. But to leave her was unthinkable. "I am Monday," he said, touching his chest. "My people are few, wounded." He looked at her, then his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "We hide. Fight Cain. The soldiers come. Hunt us." She understood. For him to bring his warriors here, even if he could reach them in time, would be to expose them to the full wrath of the U.S. Army. Cain's plan was diabolical, because it was a trap for all of them. Fighting back would prove Cain's lie correct. "Then you should go," Abigail said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. She placed her hand on his arm. "Warn them. I can't. I won't be the reason they are found." Kyle looked down at her hand, then back to her face. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a heartbreaking resolve. She was willing to face Cain's men alone to protect a people she had never met. It was an act of courage that mirrored her own on the night of the blizzard. "You are Jedodiah." He whispered a term she didn't understand, but the reverence in his tone was clear. "Woman of the mountain. You have the heart of a warrior." He shook his head slowly. "I do not leave you." But as the last light faded, a decision was made for them. A lone coyote howled from the east, a piercing, lonely sound. A moment later, it was answered by another from the north. Kyle stiffened his head, cocked, listening intently. The second howl was different, a slight variation in its cadence. It was a signal. His people were closer than he thought, and they were warning him. A new urgency filled him. He turned to Abigail, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You must stay inside. Bar the door. Do not fire until they fire first. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I will return," he said. It was not a promise, but a statement of fact. Then he was gone, melting into the darkness, with no more sound than a passing shadow. Abigail was alone again, but this time the loneliness was a sharp, terrifying blade. She went inside her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dropped the heavy bar across the door, the sound echoing the finality of her situation. She moved to the window pistol, in one hand peering into the inky blackness. The hours crawled by. The moon rose a cold silver disk in a sea of stars, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The night was preternaturally quiet, the usual chirping of crickets and calls of night birds absent. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Abigail thought of Thomas, of the life they had planned here. She thought of her father's gentle sermons about loving thy neighbour. And she thought of Cale, the man from a different world, who had shown her more loyalty and honour than anyone in her own. She was fighting not just for her land, but for him, for the quiet dignity he represented, for the impossible, dangerous love that had grown between them. As the first faint hint of grey began to lighten the eastern sky, she heard it. The soft jingle of a bridle, the muffled tread of a horse. They were here. She raised the pistol, her hand steady, and peered through the firing slit Cale had prepared. She could see them now, dark shapes moving in the pre-dawn gloom. 6 of them, including Jedodiah and Caleb Cain. They were dismounting at the edge of the tree line, rifles in hand. The gathering storm was about to break. The clearing was bathed in the ghostly grey of false dawn. Abigail could see the men spreading out, moving with a practiced predatory silence. Jedodiah Cain was directing them with hand signals, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't leading a posse. He was leading a pack of wolves. They were taking cover behind trees, and the rocky outcrop near the creek forming a semicircle around the cabin. Abigail's breath came in shallow, controlled puffs. Her world had shrunk to this small log box, and the patch of ground visible through the narrow slit. The heavy pistol felt like an extension of her own will. Cale's instructions echoed in her mind. Do not fire until they fire first. The first shot would legitimize their story. She had to wait. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then Caleb Cain, emboldened by the lack of response, broke cover and sprinted towards the lean-to. He carried a torch. "Burn 'em out!" Jedodiah roared, his voice shattering the stillness. A shot rang out, and a splinter of wood flew from the doorframe near Abigail's head. The siege had begun. Abigail didn't hesitate. She steadied the pistol with both hands, aimed at the running figure of Caleb, and fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder. The shot was wide, kicking up dirt near Caleb's feet, but it was enough. He yelped and dove behind Clementine's water trough, dropping the torch which sputtered and died in the damp earth. Another shot came from the trees, this one shattering the single glass pane of her window, showering the room in glittering shards. The fight was on. She dropped to the floor, crawling to the other side of the cabin where Thomas's Winchester lay. She knew she was hopelessly outmatched. 1 woman against 6 armed men. Her only hope was that Cale would return. But as another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls, a cold despair began to seep into her resolve. Maybe he had thought better of it. Maybe he had chosen his people. She couldn't blame him. Then an arrow hissed out of the darkness from the woods behind the cabin. It struck one of Cain's hired guns in the shoulder with a sickening thud. The man screamed, dropping his rifle and clawing at the shaft protruding from his clavicle. Kyle was here. He hadn't abandoned her. A surge of adrenaline and hope coursed through Abigail. They weren't just attacking a lone woman anymore. They were caught in a crossfire. Chaos erupted among Cain's men. They spun around, firing blindly into the trees where the arrow had come from. "He's over there! The savage is in the rocks!" someone yelled. While they were distracted, Abigail rose to the window. Slit took careful aim with the Winchester and fired at the flash of a rifle from behind a large pine. A cry of pain answered her shot. 2 down. From his new position, Cale loosed another arrow, this one catching a man in the thigh, pinning him to the ground. He had turned the tables. He was a ghost in the woods, his silent weapon finding its mark, while the hired guns wasted ammunition on shadows. "He's flanking us! Watch the ridge!" Jedodiah bellowed, his voice laced with fury and a hint of panic. He and Caleb were crouched behind the large rock formation, a position that shielded them from both the cabin and Kyle's arrows. "It's just one of them. Rush the damn cabin!" Two of the remaining men, their nerve breaking, decided to follow his order. They broke cover and charged the front door, their rifles blazing. Abigail met them with fire, but she knew she couldn't stop them both. They were almost to the porch when two more arrows flew, not from the woods, but from the trees to the east. They struck both men in the back. They crumpled to the ground, silenced. Abigail stared in disbelief. It wasn't just Cale. From the trees, 3 more Apache warriors emerged, silent and deadly, their faces grim. Cale stepped out to join them. He had not just returned. He had brought his brothers. He had gambled everything for her. Jedodiah Cain saw them, and the blood drained from his face. His plan was in ruins. This wasn't a contained raid. It was a battle. He and Caleb were now pinned, their hired guns, dead or wounded. "We got to get out of here." Caleb shrieked, his bravado gone, replaced by pure terror. But as they scrambled to retreat, another figure appeared, riding hard over the rise. Sheriff Brody, a rifle in his hands, followed by 2 armed deputies. He must have been suspicious enough of Cain's story to come and see for himself. He reined in his horse, his weary eyes taking in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance, the dead and wounded gunman Abigail with a rifle in her cabin window, and the 4 Apache warriors standing over their fallen enemies. And Jedodiah and Caleb Cain caught red-handed. The truth was laid bare in the morning light. There was no raid. This was an armed assault on a homesteader. "Drop your weapons, Cain!" Sheriff Brody's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying the undeniable weight of the law. It was over. Jedodiah Cain, his face a mask of utter disbelief and hatred, slowly let his rifle fall to the ground. His reign over the valley had ended in the blood and mud of Abigail Thorne's front yard. In the aftermath, the story that Jedodiah Cain had tried to write was erased and replaced with the truth. Faced with the testimony of Sheriff Brody and his deputies, the town of Redemption was forced to confront the venom in its own heart. The Cains were arrested, their land and power broken, their name becoming a curse rather than a crown. Abigail Thorne, the woman they had shunned, was now the quiet, resilient hero of the valley. But her world had been irrevocably changed. She no longer belonged to the town, nor did she want to. Her home was on her 40 acres, a bridge between 2 worlds. Kyle and his people returned to the secrecy of the mountains, but the bond remained. The spring on her land was shared a place of peace and sustenance. The eagle feather on her mantelpiece was a constant reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Her story and Kyle's became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that a single act of kindness, sharing a simple blanket in a storm, can be powerful enough to start a fire of gratitude that can change the world. Thank you for listening to this story of survival courage and the unlikely love that blossomed in the harsh heart of the Wild West. If this story moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who loves a tale of defiance and hope, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the past. We have many more stories to tell, and we'd be honored to have you with us for everyone. Until next time, stay curious and courageous.